Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Identity Podcast. Today, I am joined by Gordon Leary. Gordon is a Brooklyn-based musical theater writer originally from Chagrin Falls, Ohio. They write human-scale musicals and maybe some plays that investigate, question, and explore ideas of empathy, community, the search for identity, joy, grief, the power of legacy, and growing up. They tell stories drawn equally from real life and the mythologies of American popular culture. Gordon treasures collaboration, inquiry, and the theatrical imagination. Hi, Gordon.
Hello.
I'm so glad
That's
you're.
so, it's so funny to hear you read my bio that I like, you know, took my time trying to figure out like the smallest way, smallest number of words in which to let someone land on my website. So I appreciate hearing it back several years later.
I love it. I think that just speaks so much to like what you do.
Good.
That skill amazes me beyond belief because my brain just processes so many things. I don't know how, like teach me, Jedi, teach me.
It's my least favorite thing. Biographies and synopses are the things that just, I'm like, you want me to distill? I generate, I don't distill.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. Well, after reading that professional website bio, how does that define you? Are there things that are left out from what you've said because you did have to distill?
Um, I don't think there are things that are left out. I would say that the craziest part of it is I'm always trying to figure out tone and like the difference between sounding professional and sounding like myself. And
Yeah.
it's something that every time I apply for a grant, every time I fill out an application form, there's always the push and pull of like, I am a writer, so my voice is like really important. And how do I make sure I'm communicating not just the information, but also like the essence of who I am and what I do? And
Yeah.
so I think, I used to have a very like, here are credits, here are the organizations with which I've worked, with whom I've worked, with which I've worked. See, I can't be formal. um,
Me neither.
and so I feel like that bio was an attempt to be a little more in my voice, I think. Uh, yeah, so I'm sure it'll get an edit sometime soon.
Noted. Because we are constantly evolving creatures.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I feel like so much of identity is voice. And through the media you create, I mean, can we talk a little bit about like how do you channel your voice? Like, is this a conscious part of your process when you're writing?
Um, I feel like I always, it, it's an important part of my writing to make sure that I uh, am writing things that sound like they're being spoken.
Yeah.
Um, and so I have lots of ellipses and lots of like, just like I'm doing now, like starting to say something and then rephrasing and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And so I think those kinds of like very human things are. I think the humanity of a voice is what gets me. And there are people for whose voice is very formal and who speak with precision and all of those things. And so, there are rare instances when those people appear in my work. But it is something that interests me is like, how do people actually speak? And I actually think as a lyricist, it's a thing that I have always try, like I always try to keep things simple. I'm not big on being clever or like being a show off with like the play of language. There are times when it certainly lands, but I also think that I always try to make sure that the things that I'm writing and the characters that I'm writing sound like real people.
Yeah.
And then the joy and magic of musical theater is that I then give that to my collaborator, and they can make it sound like more than just a person, or they can make it sound like an even more specific person, or they can locate that person in a specific world or something like that. So
So cool.
yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so, because I just think it's so fascinating. So your creative process, so you are a lyricist and you work with someone who is a composer.
Yes.
How does that? Because I think most people don't, I mean, I don't know how many folks know about that whole process. I've been in the world of musical theater and I don't think I understand how that process really goes.
I think it's different for each collaboration. I think, my primary collaborator, Julia Meinwald, we are both like well, first of all, we are both very private writers, and we don't, the idea of like going into a room and writing something together terrifies us both. And we also have very different processes where I am like let me think about this for 3 weeks, then write a few lines, and then come back and rewrite it and all that stuff. And Julia has this magical ability to like say, from 1:30 to 4:30 on this day, I'm going to write the music for this song.
Wow.
And that just like mystifies me. I mean, I'm in awe of that. Because it's so the opposite of me. Like usually I just have to say, okay, this night I'm staying up and I won't let myself sleep until I finish something.
Good Lord.
Because I've been thinking about it for three weeks, sometimes 3 years.
Yeah.
And so our writing process is like, I mean, we of course talk and agree on what things are going to be. Primarily when we're first exploring, sometimes I will just be like, oh, I had this weird idea and here's the lyric. But primarily it's, I generate a full lyric and send it to her. She sets it, and then there's back and forth from there. So our process is like discussion based, but not we don't generate together necessarily. Whereas I've had other collaborations where that is the case, where sometimes we'll be talking about a moment and the composer will say, I have this musical idea, and then I write lyrics to an existing melody, and things like that. So there isn't a hard and fast rule, and I think there are certainly people who do it any number of other ways too. It's just about finding what feels organic and feels like, I don't want to say safe because that's not the right word, but feels like the best way for you to be creative.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, how do you end up finding, like, because it's such an organic process, how do you decide like, oh, this is the direction we're going, this is the topic I really want to dive into? Like, how do you organically find like the story that you want to tell?
It is almost always like finding a story that mystifies me or shocks me, or like, my like grant answer is I always look for stories that pose questions that I don't know the answer to, or people that do things that I would never do, and I use my writing to find those answers. And not even answers, because I don't think that, as a storyteller, I don't think it's my goal to provide answers to people. It's my goal to like make people think and maybe guide them towards what I think, but they don't have to necessarily agree. I think I always like a musical that ends on a question, rather than a like, here's, I would not be a good Aesop, let's say. I'm not here for morals.
No.
I'm here for explorations.
Yes.
And so I think most of the time I have an idea and will email Julia and be like, is this crazy? And she's like, no, that's great. I think, you know, a lot of them are pulled from uh kind of, as my bio said, like pop culture mythology. So things that are like little random articles you hear about, or things that are on at like 6:28 at the local news, like little human interest stories that are strange.
Yeah.
Um, and those are things that really interest me. Um, and just things that like resonate with what I want to know about the world, which is, you know, how people, how and why people are people.
Yes. It's interesting because we have different, like we came from similar backgrounds, but we have different avenues at which we've explored that same conundrum.
Mhm.
But it's the same query that we're both kind of like navigating just in such different ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So weird.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, so like you've written, I love that you choose these that you, like you're pulled to like the human interest stories. Like and yours, honestly, you have been a pillar to me of like the holding the reverence of pop culture. Like
Yes.
you do it in multifaceted ways, whether it's through writing or art. Like, can you talk about like what that journey has been for you?
Yeah, um I think I've always been interested in like ideas of celebrity and fame and infamy.
Yeah.
Um and I think part of that is being a proud elder millennial. Um I think that I think that ideas of fame shifted with that, generally with the advent of the internet and social media and all of that.
Mhm.
Um, do you consider do you consider yourself Gen X fully, or you're an
Nope.
elder millennial too? Yeah.
I'm like that in between. I think that like it's interesting to me too because like I like when I've been in relationships and I'm partnered with someone who's within the same age bracket, but they're
Hmm.
like a little bit older than me, they identify as Gen X.
Hmm.
And it's like literally months.
Yeah.
But I more gravitate towards like millennial culture because like I was still like going to shows or like interested in whatever was being created that like I think at a certain point maybe some people are like I'm going to put my focus towards these other things, but I've
Sure.
always wanted to like whatever's being created I'm like yes 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 chomp chomp chomp.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but I also think that there is uh, there's like a shift from cynicism towards like just kind of searching for a pure joy.
Yes.
And I think that that is part of what draws me to pop culture
Yeah.
um is finding the joy in it all, and finding, I mean, you know, I have this, you reference drawings, I have this long standing art project is portraits of primarily Real Housewives, although I've branched out into other things because there's a limited number of Real Housewives at moments that I can. After 4 years, I've gotten through most of them, I should say. Um, but I think there's like a, I don't want to say reverence, but like
Mm.
there's like a respect for them as humans that I enjoy, and there's like it's possible to both wink at something and love it, and
Yes.
it's possible to uh, be laughing along with something with respect, like, and I think that that's the like divide between, and I think that that is a very specifically elder millennial thing, that holding both of those almost polar opposites,
Yeah.
um, or bridging between those two things is feels like a being part of the little bridge micro generation.
Yeah.
um, uh, but yeah, and when it comes to musicals, I feel like the stories that I want to tell when I start telling people about what I'm writing, people are always like, "Oh, that's hilarious," assuming that I'm going to make fun of whatever it is.
Yeah.
The first musical that Julia and I wrote together is called Pregnancy Pact. We started it in 2009, which was the year, or I forget if the actual thing happened in 2008 or 2009, but it was, there's this story that appeared in Time magazine about Gloucester, Massachusetts, and this rash of pregnancies at their school, and the principal blamed it on the girls making a pact to get pregnant together. 2 months later, reporting came out that it was actually because the school changed their policy to give students free pregnancy tests, but not free condoms. And so it was a policy thing that led to that. And they were in a school where it felt like they didn't have options, and or they were in a time and in a place where it felt like many of them felt like they didn't have options. There was no pact or anything like that, but that took hold of the imagination, and there were Lifetime movies about it, and there were summer beach reads about it. And when I read that article, I was like, this is fascinating. What in the world would make people do this? And so then when I started to say I want to write a musical about this, people would be like, oh, that's so funny. And I'd be like, but it's not funny. It may be funny to someone else, but that's not what interests me.
Yeah.
And I think that goes along with even the funny things that I write. I don't think are funny for the reasons people assume they will be funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like to make fun of people. I don't like to I'm not interested in heroes and villains and things like that.
Yeah.
Now I feel like I've gotten away from pop culture, but yeah, it's all
but it's all connected.
Yeah, you can see, Kenya Moore twirling in on the Real Housewives of Atlanta, saying she's gone with the wind, fabulous, and yes, it's silly, but there's also something wonderful about it, and it's beautiful, the colors that she's wearing against the background, and so drawing it is funny, but it doesn't have to be making fun of people.
Yeah. So I feel like whether you're writing a musical or you're creating a piece of art, what I hear and what you say is finding the humanity in whatever the subject is what keeps you away from mockery, keeps you connected to what the felt experience is, the human experience of it. And I feel like whether someone thinks that content would be hilarious, if the more you stay grounded in that humanity, that's how I know in our previous conversations we've talked about camp, and camp done well is a story that has the humanity in it, and maybe we'll have moments of humor, but there's a real felt sense of I feel with this character, or I see this piece of art and I'm oh, I remember that, but also I felt that
absolutely. It's this balance of irreverence and reverence.
Yeah.
It's how do you hold both of those at the same time? Yeah. As a musical theater writer, musical theater, not to go all Rodney Dangerfield, but there is a certain there's a certain I don't know, sheen over musical theater that people make assumptions about what it is and what it isn't.
Yes.
And so I think that in and of itself is a reason that people assume things are silly because they think musicals are silly. This is a little side comment, but I feel like writing musicals is one of the only things that people can look at you and say, oh, I hate the thing that you make, and feel like that's fine. I've had so many good friends of mine be like, well, musicals are stupid. And I'm but or be like, well, I don't like musicals. And I'm but that's literally what I'm devoting my life to.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think there's like a little dismissiveness about musicals.
Yeah.
But so that's separate from camp, I guess.
Well, I mean,
Or maybe is it not?
maybe not, because I feel like, okay, so I want, okay, so here's a wondering I have. Do you
Mhm.
think that like disdain for musical theater stems from like assumption based on like classical musical theater, where it's like the, you know, the very predictable tropes that
I honestly think it stems from people being forced to go see their friends in their high school musicals. I
laugh
mean,
because yeah.
they're maybe 7 to 8% of high school musicals are good and well done. But like that's part of how people learn,
Yeah.
you know.
Gotta start
And
somewhere.
Oklahoma is a phenomenal, incredible musical.
Yes.
Anything by Rodgers and Hammerstein, they
True.
like invented the form.
They did.
Anything by The Pajama Game is a wonderful musical and
I feel
silly
like
and
that's
fun and all that.
a show ahead of its time.
Yeah, I love The Pajama Game. But
It's so good.
but when you see that with when you see it done in a certain setting, in a certain whatever, and you get the sense that that's what it is, then people are primed to think that that's all musicals are.
Fair.
I just think I've started to turn that around to be like, well, if people can say that they think musicals are stupid to my face, then I have no problem saying I think that Marvel movies are stupid to people's faces, even when they're wearing
Yeah.
I don't think I know anyone who wears Avengers shirts, but when people are like talking about, oh, isn't it amazing? And I'm like, you think it's silly that people sing out of nowhere, but I think it's silly that people take superheroes seriously when they are silly too. Like, I don't know.
It's all, I mean, all of it could be misconstrued as silly without that context to the humanity in it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's come back to the camp piece.
Yes.
I totally because I asked that question because I got like curious about it. And it's not me dissing on classical musical theater, just to say, because West Side Story is still one of my all-time favorite shows I've ever been in, I've ever seen.
Oh, absolutely. Who did you play?
I'm embarrassed.
You don't have to say.
I'm embarrassed.
Did you play Maria?
Yes.
It's okay. We all have those moments. We all have those times that we shouldn't have done them.
I shouldn't have
done it. But it was a different time. It was a different time. We wouldn't do them now.
No, we would not.
Which is also funny because you'd be a great Graziella.
Ugh.
Oobly oo.
Ugh. I would love.
Or is that whatever the other one is?
Yeah.
I forget. Graziella and.
Yeah. It's been a minute since I've seen it.
Velma? Is it Velma?
No, in the Sharks?
Yeah.
In the Jets.
In the Jets.
The Jets. I don't know because I wasn't in the Jets world.
Yeah.
Wah. But back to camp.
But back to camp. I mean, that's camp.
I mean,
casting a white girl is camp.
Truth.
But high schoolers don't know what camp is, and therefore they see it, and the high schoolers who are performing it don't understand that it's camp, and so maybe that's why people don't like musicals. But
I wonder the misunderstanding of what camp is.
Well, that gets to the question of whether camp is always intentional or not, but which I don't know the answer to.
Okay, here's a question as we start talking about this topic. What is the campiest show you've ever seen that was done perfectly? Not perfectly, but really great.
The best use of camp to me is always Charles Busch. The one that I saw multiple times was The Divine Sister, which was a send-up of nun movies.
Okay.
But everything by Charles Busch is like definitionally camp.
Mm-hmm.
Everything by the B-52s is definitionally camp.
Yes.
Everything by And I think there's a difference between camp and comedy. I think camp is, there's like an archness and a queerness to it always.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but I think that that is like, Charles Busch is my, and the B-52s are my gold standard for
Okay.
what camp is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
What about you?
hmm. I mean, if I'm just narrowing it down to musical theater, I'm going to go back to one of the shows that I remember talking to you about many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie Does Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the first show that I saw that where I was actively aware, like, okay, we are playing with so many different, but there's heart in it. There's
Yeah.
like I felt connected to, like I felt connected to the characters in a way that I would in a comedy or a drama of any other
Yeah.
format. And I had never had that experience. So if I'm just talking about theater, I'd say Debbie Does Dallas. However, I mean, my number one movie that I love of all time is the campiest piece of stuff that has ever existed. It's a parody of the Pirates of Penzance, but it was done in, I think, 1982 or 1983. It's called The Pirate Movie. And they take
Who is in it?
Christopher Atkins and Christy McNichol.
Okay, I feel like I have.
I might have
I
forced you to
I
watch
need.
it at some point.
Okay,
It's on YouTube. You can watch the whole movie for free. But
wonderful.
they take some of the actual Gilbert and Sullivan music, rewrite the lyrics. So, like during "I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General," it's like,
Uh-huh.
"Man, I'm older than the Beatles, but I'm younger than the Rolling Stones. He's older than the Beatles, but he's younger than the Rolling Stones." It's ridiculous. So there's that part of it, but then there's also, because of the time frame, they wrote their own 80s synth pop,
Wonderful.
and it's all done as a dream sequence
Amazing.
because we love a dream sequence. We love a dream sequence. But like, so yeah, like there's like real, like the graphics, like when they meet on a beach, which I visited in Australia because I love the movie so much. I went to all the places they filmed it.
That's incredible.
But when they meet on the beach, there's this like superimposed, you know, like those pictures from, was it Olin Mills in like the 80s where they have
Oh yeah.
the head in the background and then the person's in the
Uh-huh.
front, like,
Yeah.
that's how the like meeting is on the beach where they're like singing to each other, but then there's this like superimposed floating head of them singing. Oh God.
Incredible.
It's
Incredible.
and that was my introduction to camp, was when I was like a baby. Like that movie had been out for a few years by the time I saw it. And I fell in love with it. I watched it like, I want to say every day.
Incredible.
It's that.
That I feel like my introduction was probably Big Business,
Oh.
which I feel like qualifies.
Yeah.
Lily Tomlin and Bette Midler.
Mhm.
But
All right. So can we talk about, speaking of like finding material in camp and all these things, can we talk about the musical that you wrote about Anita Bryant?
yes, R.I.P.
Yes.
Rest in pie. That wasn't my joke. I think it was Coco Peru's joke.
Okay.
So I can't claim credit for it, but it was too perfect.
Okay.
Yes, she just passed away
Mm-hmm.
a few weeks ago
Mm-hmm.
at 84. She would have turned 85 in March.
Okay. Was this one of those experiences where you saw a story and said, "Oh, I got to write about that"?
It was, and I feel like it's pretty emblematic in that it was like I saw a moment, which is the moment that Anita Bryant got a pie thrown in her face, and was like, that's the kernel of an idea, and then found the story around that. And I think that that's, pulling from pop culture, that's kind of been the most rewarding thing. But yeah, the video of Tom Higgins throwing the pie in her face, posing as a journalist, throwing a pie in her face, and then she and her husband, she says at least it's a fruit pie, which is hilarious. And then she remembers that she should start to cry, and she and her husband pray for him and all this stuff. And it just felt like, I wanted to know what brought him there and what brought her there.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, and so, yeah. And so the story grew out of that. I think at first I didn't even think that he was going to be that big a part of it. I thought maybe he would be like always lurking with a pie in the background. I thought it would be much sillier than it wound up being.
That would have been a very different show.
Yes. But what it wound up being was, kind of somewhat controversially humanizing Anita. I think, for me, there's a fine line between empathy and sympathy.
Yes, there is. Big.
And this is a show that's big on empathy and not big on sympathy. So this show wound up being kind of like dual protagonist story. And it's weird to say that the protagonist of the musical is Anita Bryant, who is a generally and deservedly reviled person among my various communities, and whose legacy comes back up all the time. Save our children, in the current discussion about grooming and all those horrifying things. But there is a part of me that's like, well, she was a person at one point before she was a caricature, and how did she get there?
Yeah.
And how did, because she was semi-famous. She had a million lives. She, reading about her, she was this person, the kind of person who was like, I am born for something great. She was like, I'm going to mess up the story because it's been a while since I read her biography, but she was born and pronounced dead at birth, and then her grandmother brought her back to life. And
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact story, but something where she was like, I was saved by God for something great. And so the story is about her trying to find what that greatness is. And she, we first meet her when she loses Miss America. And then we see her be like a middling pop star, and then a spokeswoman, spokes-homemaker for orange juice, which is probably where she became most famous, was as the orange juice lady. And then all these different things. And then she went on this crusade against, it was specifically against gay teachers in Miami. There was an ordinance that she spoke up against that would allow for the firing of employees. It was a non-discrimination ordinance. And she spoke out against it, and then kind of took off nationally and had the whole Save Our Children campaign and everything like that.
Yeah.
And so it's not a traditional hero. And then that her story is told next to the story of a more imagined story of Tom Higgins, who there isn't a ton to know about him. So in our story, he's Tommy, and in many ways, he's a surrogate for me in that story, talking about, what it felt like to grow up, what it felt like to come out, what it felt like to be disillusioned by people who you once looked up to, and all this stuff. And so it, in the end, they meet in the pie, with a pie in the face.
With a pie.
And it starts out, the first song is Tommy baking a pie with his mom, and she says, whenever life is bad, there's always pie. And that comes true in the end.
Genius.
But it's like it is also a silly show. There are 6 actors who play all of Anita and Tommy, and then an ensemble of 4 who play all of the other characters, including Tammy Faye and Phil Donahue and Lawrence Welk and Kathy Lee Gifford, who was, as a child or as a young woman, was Anita Bryant's babysitter when she was Catherine Epstein, right
Wow.
after she
Wow.
was born again. Yeah, I
Wow.
mean, and it's like one of those. There's so much pop culture in it, and so much like so many little reference points
Yeah.
that were so much fun for me too. And Marianne Mobley is the person she lost Miss America to, who went on to become another like minor celebrity who was like the kind of person who was on Love Boat and things like
Mhm.
that, and was was on '70s game shows and et cetera, et cetera. Was married to, I want to say, Gary Cooper. Like it just, there's all that fun classic pop culture. And when we did our production of it, they our amazing, incredible costume. Well, the set design was, we did a production at Diversionary Theater in San Francisco or San Diego, sorry, which is the third oldest LGBT theater company in the country. Wonderfully, they're an incredible little theater who does and they do big things. And our set design was made to look, it almost looked like the Match Game set. Like there were
Yes.
little, or like Laugh-In / Match Games. So there are like windows that people could pop out of. And the costumes for all of the like celebrities were almost like paper doll cutouts. So people had like a neutral costume. And for the people in Tommy's life, and like Anita's sister and things like that, they wore regular clothing. But like when the actress came out as Kathy Lee, she had like paper sculpted hair and a flat dress in front of her that she danced with. And so there's that like archness about it and
Yeah.
that sensibility about it that is camp in its way.
Yeah. There's
That was
there's
long, sorry.
That's okay. Like there's so many pieces. I like took a couple notes because I was like, I want to come back to that. I want to come back to that. I think this whole process of like the unlikely hero in the story, I'm hearing like so much about like when you say the difference between empathy and sympathy. And I talk to people a lot about that in the work that I do because like
Mm-hmm.
Brene Brown, I don't know if you've ever seen Brene Brown's video about the difference between empathy and sympathy.
I have not, no.
Oh, it's a great one. It's on YouTube. It's like a little cartoon, and someone has animated it. And I don't know the illustrator, so I feel bad for bringing it up without naming the illustrator. But the whole concept of the video is like saying empathy is feeling with the other, and sympathy is essentially trying to divert someone's attention away from. So like empathy is, oh, this is terrible. Tell me about it. Can I sit with you in this? Sympathy is, oh, sorry, that sucks. You want a sandwich? Like,
Right.
like that's sympathy. And I think when you're telling this story about, like, when you're choosing to write this story and you're like, okay, I'm going to write this show about this person that has made efforts that are not necessarily full of empathy, but I'm choosing to write a story about empathy and I'm going to tell both characters' stories.
Mm-hmm.
I hear in what you're saying is like, I will infuse humanity into both characters because that is the bridge between myself. And I know you said like Tommy's character is like the voice that might be your voice in the story.
Right.
But it also sounds like you're infusing the humanity into Anita's character as well, so that it's like the bridge builder between the differences.
Mm-hmm.
Does that, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts of that? It feels very poignant to me as we speak about this today in 2025.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that it goes back to this whole idea that I don't necessarily fully invest in the idea of heroes and villains.
Yeah.
I don't invest in ideas of, because the second you have a hero and a villain, someone is another and someone loses their humanity on both sides. I mean, you know,
Yes.
because then heroes have to become infallible and can't be human, and
Mhm,
villains are deprived of their humanity.
mhm.
And yes, there are people who do terrible things, and there are people who are doing terrible things right now. Uh, but I think the only way, I think not the only way, because I don't know how to solve the world problems, but I think that the approach that resonates with me is to think about the human side of it,
Mhm.
because I think the only way you can connect with people is through humanity.
Yes.
Um, and the only way I can talk to people who I have political disagreements with is by recognizing that there are a person and not, you know, what's the Gen Z, not an op. Um,
Yeah.
to show my to show my 1.5 generations to remove from the lingo. Um, but and I think that a lot of the things that I write about are like that. That, you know, it's not about letting people off the hook. It's not about uh, making excuses for people,
Mhm.
because seeing someone as human isn't making an excuse for them.
Yep.
Uh, it is saying this is the place where it's the only possible way that we can meet is by having empathy for one another.
Mhm.
Um, and the only way that I can tell you that you're wrong is by talking to you as a human and not as, you know, I think it's
Yeah.
the opposite of Twitter, basically, or X. I don't
Yeah.
like calling it X, but the opposite of social media is, you know, is that is empathy.
Yeah. It takes the humanity out of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Ugh. And to me, it just screams like all the more reason, like all the more importance for art.
Hmm.
Because art is like the creation of art is finding that connectivity, not only from character to character, but from characters to audience.
Hmm.
It's like, so this kind of like then starts to lean us towards the idea of perception. Um, but just it just feels so, I don't know, it just feels so important right now. I don't know what I have to say about that.
Yeah, well, and I think that right now is a it's a hard time it's a hard time to think deeply, because there's so much to think about and there's so much coming at us at all times, and so it's hard to like let me sit for an afternoon and think about this one idea, because then you get a push notification on your phone that, oh, there have been 2 plane crashes. Like, it's just nonstop bombardment.
Mhm,
um and that's really overwhelming. But yeah, yeah, the
mhm.
it's and I think that's been going on for 8 years now, 9 years now, that in one way or another there's like this overarching sense of dread, uh, that's hard to push through. Well, this is the sad part of the
Yeah,
of the conversation,
yeah. Well,
but but
real.
I think that yeah, and I think that it's easy to get caught up in the dread when it's about forces rather than people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, without the humanity in it. So
yeah.
that makes me think about the individual versus collective experience. And I know in our previous conversations we've talked a little bit about that, but we were talking about it in through the lens of creation, like creating art. There's my individual experience, and then there's also what the collective experience of this piece of art really will be.
Hmm.
Um, we can tie it to being an artist in the world that we live in now, or we can tie it to just the general experience, your choice. How do you navigate individual identity versus like collective experience identity? Like how do we maneuver through that when you're creating a piece of art?
uh, Well, I think in musical theater, there's very little room for individual identity because it is an entirely collaborative form. Theater in general is collaborative, but I think that musical theater is made by a community. So while I may have the germ of the idea, the, silly metaphor, but like I may be the grain of sand, but the pearl is made by everyone. um, so like, yeah, I mean, I think there's so many layers of community in musical theater that, I write a lyric, but then my lyric is forever changed by the way that the composer sets it, which is forever changed by the voice of the person who sings it,
Yeah.
both practically and just interpretively. There's no, I am not a performer like that. And so I need someone else to do those things.
Yeah.
And then working with a director and a creative team will always bring out new things about it and bring, I think even if it just starts with my point of view, the point of view of the piece will always come back to me, but it will always be shaped by other people. Talking about the production of The Loneliest Girl in the World, the Anita Bryant show, like I had no idea how it would be designed. And that is not how I would have thought that it would be designed, but it gave so much, it built upon the ideas of the show so much, to have paper doll costumes and a game show set.
Yeah.
And so, there are all of those layers. And then the last layer is I write for audiences. I don't write, well, I mean, I always have to answer. I always hate the question, who is your audience? Because I'm like, my audience is people. But I wouldn't get anywhere if I only wrote for myself. So like the last thing is always the audience is the final collaborator, in figuring out what art is. Yeah, and I think so I think I mean, I don't think there is any kind of art that isn't in its nature a collective experience.
That's fair, because once you
I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, like once something goes into a museum, the curator is deciding where it goes, how it's not always even how it's displayed, but what it's next to, what story it's telling within a room, within a gallery.
Yeah.
And the people walking by are experiencing it the way that they're experiencing it. And so, a painting is a painting, but the way that people see the painting is just as much about the painting, is just as much the definition of the painting as what the artist put onto the canvas.
Yeah. It's like that concept of like you create something, but once you give it to the world, it takes on a new, so this concept of transformation, like how big is the transformation? Is it a partial transformation? Is it a full transformation? But we don't ever really actually know if it's the audience experience or like, perceiver of the art, because we don't have all of their like background of experiences in which they see through the lenses of. But if it's theater, I think it's just so much about like the reaction to, like, do people say whoa after a show, or did we tell other people about it? I saw the show, I'd like you to go see it too, it was important. I feel like once that type of response is often the like, that's the transformation, where it's no longer, it's like, whenever we do a show and the director's like, this is your show now, go off, and it's like I remember being like a young theater kid being like, I don't even know what that means, I'm just going to do what you told me to do and I'll do it. But then later, like after doing a long running show, I was like, oh, this changes, like little nuances every day different because it
Mhm.
does become its own thing. But then like I think about the creative process of making that show. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that must be has there ever been a time that you've created a show and said, wow, I did not expect that to be the response, but it's changed it completely?
Um, Gosh, I don't. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, there's certainly, that's the power of doing a reading and doing a workshop and things like that,
Yeah.
is understanding how rhythms work and understanding what is resonating with people.
Mm,
Um, and I think there are. I, I mean, I do think that you're always looking for how people respond.
mm,
I've been very lucky to be able to have been writing a lot. A lot of what I've written has been in writers groups, so there's like constantly getting feedback from other writers and directors and things.
mhm,
Um, and so there's that level. There's like then when you finally present a full thing, there's that level of response and feedback, and
mhm,
there are um, a lot of, I think a lot of what I look for is confirmation in the things that land,
mm,
and then finding, because you can tell from the get-go if something is confusing.
mhm,
um and yeah, there have certainly been times that I've presented things and people have been very confused by them.
mm,
And that's fine and that's useful.
mm.
um it doesn't feel good in the moment, but it's useful.
That's fair. Yeah. Uh, can we talk a little bit about the show that you're working on now?
Yeah, yeah.
I love it. I love it, and I want the world to know about it.
Oh, thank you. Well, so it's called These Familiar Spirits,
Mm,
and it is about a reunion of some of the Salem witch trial accusers,
mm,
um, who come back to Salem Village 23 or so years after the end um, of the trials and the witch hysteria and everything that was going on then. So it's set in 1716 as they come back to attend the funeral of one of their fellow accusers. Um, and we follow four women who are now in their 30s and 40s, who are kind of revisiting this moment for the first time. Three of the four of them haven't returned there since they left after the trials. And they've all gone on to have families and have homes and all of these things, but they've been kind of haunted by those events and what they did and what was done to them and all sorts of things. And at the same time, while those four uh, survivors of it come together, there are also a handful of ghosts of people who have passed away in those intervening years who um, are there as well, kind of guiding the living people in towards a resolution that then comes when the magic happens and the two worlds collide and they face what they've done. And yeah, I mean, our stupid elevator pitch of it is this is the Crucible meets the Big Chill. um but you know it's not the Crucible because the Crucible is a wonderful play, but the Crucible has very little to do with history. um and
mhm,
so it's some of the names that you would recognize from the Crucible if you know the Crucible,
mhm,
but the people are very, very different.
mhm,
um and yeah, it came out of, we started writing it, or I guess I had the idea, much like all things. I was like, I wonder if anyone knows what happened to Mercy Lewis. And I've always loved Mercy Lewis because her the stage direction that introduces her in the Crucible is something like she's like a fat and sly girl of 17 or something like that. Fat and sly or plump and sly, something like that.
Oh.
And I've always just been like, who is the person who is describing this poor, like that is how she's remembered forever.
Mm-hmm.
And and there are other pieces of art there are TV shows that have used her and other things,
Mm-hmm.
but I've always been like, well, whatever happened to her? And so I started researching it, um, and found out the stories of all sorts of the accusers. Um, and when I found out that Ann Putnam Jr., who was one of the main accusers, her parents, the Putnams, Thomas and Anne Sr., were like in some tellings of the story were like the people who pushed it forward to gain more power in the town and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
So when I found out that she died when she was 36, it felt like that was an opportunity to bring them all together.
Mm-hmm.
And they all, they lived in Gloucester or Woburn or, places that were not far from Salem Village, which is different from Salem.
Mm-hmm.
Now Danvers, Massachusetts is now the town that at one point had the witch trials. But yeah, and it just is like so yeah, we started thinking about it in like late 2020, early 2021, as like, how do we, a story about reckoning with harms that you have caused and harms that have been done to you, and how in the world do you move through that? And like, these people did something terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they were puppets of other people to do these things,
Mm-hmm.
they are the names that are remembered. Abigail Williams is the name that is remembered as like this traitorous woman who was actually an 11-year-old girl who did not have an affair with John Proctor, who was 60.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Arthur Miller. But also, like, the story is that they were like doing stupid little fortune telling things to find out about their future husbands as 11-year-olds, as a 9 and 11-year-old, and
as we do at sleepovers at that age.
Exactly. And Abigail, in the fortune telling they were doing, saw a coffin and was freaked out by it, and that's like the thing that started it, was like a very regular little occurrence that led to all of this, historical upheaval,
which feels, well, let's just say, wow.
yeah well, and it's also about like going back and looking at the Crucible.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about that play, when I think about stories, the girls are always the thing that's the most interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like literally barely in it. My adorable little nieces, I shouldn't call them little nieces because they're freshmen in high school, or they're in the 9th grade. Their high school did a production of The Crucible this year, and I got to go see it. And they played 2 of the accusers, and they are like literally barely in it. Abigail does more,
mm-hmm.
but like Abigail's presented as some tart, like,
yeah.
And so it was shocking to me that they were given such little voice. And again, like Anita Bryant, they're these people who did something that we understand to be terrible, but they're human beings, and they got to that place somehow and got away from that place somehow. And what is that story? And that's kind of the heart of what we're writing.
I love it. I was privileged enough to hear Act 1, at least at that point in time. I'm sure it's changed by this point, but it's so incredibly cool. Are you, like, is there a theater that's like commissioning this to be move into a production, or where are you in the journey of this?
It was commissioned by Flint Repertory Theater in Flint, Michigan. They produced the world premiere of our show, The Magnificent Seven, about the '96 Olympic women's gymnastics team, U.S. women's gymnastics team. And so we've done one reading. I think I haven't looked at our contract in a while. I think we'll have another reading, and then they have the first right of refusal to produce it, but there's no guarantee that they'll produce it. Um, but we love them. We've kind of found a sweet spot with lovely, daring, smaller regional theaters who have these really, I mean, I think they're smart artistic directors because they're programming our work, but like artistic directors who do things and like create artistic leadership that does not only our work, but work by friends and work by people we respect that like would be considered challenging. That are different from doing, a wonderful production of Noises Off, which has its own merits.
It does, but there's less risk taking and allowing new, like, I think it's a big risk to allow, like, especially for like arts organizations today, who are worried about bottom lines, but then they're not willing to allow new voices into those spaces.
Yeah, it's a freaky time
Mm-hmm.
to be making theater. But theater has always been made and always will be made, and
Amen.
it may just be a paradigm shift.
Yeah, but I'm so excited about this show, and whenever the next reiteration comes around, I want to see it.
Yes, I'm excited. We've been madly recording demos.
Love it.
Because we had a reading in November in Michigan that was very brief, and so we didn't get a full sense of the score because it was just too much to ask of actors. They did wonderful, wonderful work, and now we are bringing it back, and instead of asking 7 actors to learn 40 songs, we've asked a bunch of friends to learn a handful of songs each to record. And so we should be mixing those this month, I hope.
Nice.
Which will be nice to hear.
Nice. So Gordon, we've talked about a lot of different themes throughout this conversation, whether it's through your drawing, your art that you've made, or the pieces of theater that you've created. A lot of those themes explore the humanity and the humanity of the characters, their voice, their identities. Can you talk a little bit more about like how does self-definition of identity play into those that process? Whether it's through community, whether it's through your creative art itself, the medium. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. I think that something as a person, something that I've always struggled with is like the need for self-definition and the need for very clearly defining who I am and what I do. And I think that has come up in all sorts of things. I think, in a weird way, there was a part of me that was like scared to have this art project that gained followers online and all that kind of stuff, because I was like, no, but as an artist, I'm a musical theater writer. Even though growing up, I performed, I played piano, I was a visual artist, I, did all sorts of different arts. But then I felt, for some reason, like after college going into, and maybe it was just because I went into debt to become a musical theater writer, that I felt like I had to call myself that. But there was this moment, especially during the pandemic when we couldn't make live theater, that I was like, oh, I need to define myself less by the one thing I do, and instead define myself by how I see myself in the world and what I see more than what I do.
Mm.
And
Wait,
I
wait.
think that's,
You
yeah,
mean like what you see in the world and how you see it?
yes.
Aha.
Like my point of view is more how I define myself than the way I express that point of view. Um, and I
Fire.
think, and I think that that goes back to the questions about camp. That goes back to the questions about empathy, and goes back to all of those things that I realized that the ways I define myself as a musical theater writer are actually the ways I define myself as a person, not just
Mm.
an artist. Um, and and part of that self-definition is also constantly trying to figure out, or not trying to figure out, but like it took me a long time. I use they and them pronouns. I consider myself agender. And it took me a long time from the moment that I like first realized that in 2017 to the moment that I first asked people to use they and them pronouns. It was like 5 years, because to me, I was like, I have to know exactly what this means, and I have to know all of the specifics of what it is and who, so that when people have questions, I can answer them and
Mm.
I can feel confident about what I'm doing. And I think that that was like actually really detrimental, because again, like everything is a process and everything is part of a whole. Um, and I'm like not disappointed in myself that I didn't allow that, but like I felt like I had to work through and know how to define it.
Mhm.
Uh, that was that just wound up not being the case.
Mhm.
um, and so I think this like weird incessant need for self-definition comes out in my writing too, in that I think, from the lovely introduction that you read from my website that said it's about the search for identity, that what I've realized, and especially realized with this new project, is that uh, I write about people who are looking for the way to define themselves, that it's not just like, what's my identity? It's who am I in the world outside of how other people perceive me?
Yes.
Um, and that these, the women who grew out of being witch accusers, like in everyone else's eyes, that's who they are, and and that's how they are seen, and how can they find a way to see themselves that's different from that? Even Anita Bryant, is about defining herself. She knows that she's going to be great. What is the definition of greatness for her?
Mm.
Pregnancy Pact is about these girls who need something. There were, not to be a name dropper, but we were working on it in a writers group, and we had a guest one night when we brought in material, and it was Janine Tesori,
Oh.
and we shared the song, and she was like, you know what? Her daughter was a teenager at this point, and she was like, the thing that gets me watching my daughter grow up is that literally the way the world works now, everything is possible. And that sounds like such a wonderful thing. And it sounds like such a great, everything's wide open. But the flip side of that is that can be really overwhelming. And
Yes.
so this show became about the need of these girls to define themselves in a way that, like, the world wasn't their oyster.
Mhm.
And to go back to pearls, I guess. But like the there were too many things that they could be, and they needed to just make a decision because the world was scary otherwise.
Yeah.
And the decision that they made was, we are going to be a family. um, and so it was interesting, this like crazy aha moment when I had the realization that everything I've ever written has been about, how do I define myself apart from how the world defines me? um,
Yes.
or how do I uh, and making the hand motion of pulling things apart. How do I separate those two things?
Yeah.
And how do I know who I am, even if it's different from what other people think I am?
Yes. It's such a relevant experience today in the world that we live in, because I
Mm-hmm.
feel like there's so much multiplicity of who we are as humans in the world. Like, I'm doing a podcast with you right now. So right now I'm in the role, and there's a type of drama therapy that's like role theory, and it goes into all these like
Mm.
different roles we play in our lives. But like right now I'm in the role of podcast host. But like I don't
Right.
inhabit podcast host in every part of my life. I don't leave this and go, okay, Katz, now I'm going to ask you a question about what you want for dinner and how does that influence? Like,
Right. Right.
but like someone, but, or like I work, like when you ask somebody, who are you? They often start with, here's how I get paid in the world. I am paid as a accountant. I am paid as a lawyer. I am paid as a therapist, and therefore I'm a therapist. And so like we get so stuck in the rigidity of like what role has value.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore the perceiver seem to have value in this, and so I will share this with you. And then like you're saying with your characters, they were the accusers for a part of their life, and then they were all these other things in their lives, but we still know them as the accusers. In the world that we live in today, it's like now there's like social media influencers who are like, I'm going to make content with my dog or like whatever.
Yeah.
And they become that. And they always say, like, if you're an influencer, find your niche. They said that about when I researched podcasts. What's your niche? Like, what's your podcast about? I'm like, literally everything.
Right.
Like humanity, sense of self, like navigating the world, relationship. Like, how do we do all of this stuff? But we do it. How do we express ourselves? Like all of it. But I think what happens is people get, I know I'm rambling, but they get truncated into I'm a musical theater writer. I am an artist. I am a therapist. And you start to believe it yourself. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I went down the drama therapy path, I was like, I started saying, well, I'm an actor, I'm a singer, and I'm trying the drama therapy out as my next chapter. But the longer I was on the journey, the more I was like, I'm a therapist. And you forget, like, oh, I was also I am not was, I am also a performer. I am also, and then you get pigeonholed in your boxes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's like a certain, I find at least that like if you aren't certain, if there's not certitude about what you're doing, then you aren't really that thing.
Mm-hmm.
That like if I don't say I'm a musical theater writer, then am I really one? if I don't I don't know other examples, but like
Yeah, Schrodinger's cat. Like, does the cat exist in the box if we can't see the cat?
yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, not that social media is 100% evil. There are things that are good about it, and you can use it for many different things. But there is a certain element of uh, like just like a general branding of life more than there is defining of life. That like everything is about a brand,
Mm-hmm.
and I find that as a writer too. Like, what's your brand? And I'm like, I'm not an advertising executive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. That's not. It's hard. It's a hard thing to navigate and to figure out. And yeah, and I think that it goes back to like the ideas of empathy and grace,
Yes.
and that like it's not things are ever evolving,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing exists in the extreme. Some
Mm-hmm.
things get very close to the extreme, don't get me wrong, and
Sure
some
do.
things present as if they want to be the extreme even if they're not.
Mm-hmm.
But like real humanity exists in the, what's the word, not the in-between, in the
It's the ambiguity.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's where life is. Life is in the ambiguity, but we keep creating all these like rigid structures to try to like cling on to, because maybe like the girls in the pregnancy pack, because it's too overwhelming. There's so much.
Mm-hmm.
So might as well.
And I think, I think that, not to go back to talking shit about them, sorry to swear, I don't know if this is a swearing podcast.
You can swear all you want. Yes.
Great. Not to talk shit about superhero movies, but I feel like the reason people love superhero movies is because of like the certain amount of moral certitude that comes in them, and that there is a world in which things are good and evil, and I mean, I'm a little talking out of I don't know. I'm a little speaking out of turn because I haven't seen them, but there is like, that's what draws us to those kinds of stories is certitude. And maybe that's why I don't like superhero movies, because I don't like certitude.
Yeah, it's the ambiguity, because that's where the humanity is. The humanity is in the multiplicity. It's in the ambiguity. But when these rigid structures come in, it's like, oh, I am this. I think, yeah, you're right. Social media is not all bad, but it certainly does funnel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it like, it also forces us to only share good things and all of that stuff.
Right.
And it forces it back in the days of, well, oh gosh, what was it called? The like, was it Zynga?
Oh, Zynga.
The like journaling.
Yeah, it's like the other live journal.
App.
Yeah.
Yes, live journal. Yes. But like, we've moved so far away from that. But even that was a performance. Like,
yeah. Well,
Tumblr was a performance. Everything
is. Well, and you can detect like who's really like turning it on and who's just trying to be like, well, this is, I guess I'll just talk about this thing. Like you can feel it. You can feel it energetically.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, I've had these conversations with my own therapist of like, when I'm like, well, I'm making content for social media now. And she's like, which you are they getting? And I'm like, oh. But like,
what's masking? What's that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gordon, thank you so much for coming in and chatting with me about all the things that you do and how you navigate all of it.
Thanks for letting me. I feel like I just expounded. So thanks for giving me a platform to further define myself.
Podcast
as a podcast guest.
If folks are interested in hearing your work, seeing your work, or learning more about you, where can they find you?
You can find information on my website, which, speaking of camp and like an encapsulation of my identity, is omfgordon.com. And
I always love
that's the best place.
I love remembering that is your website. Like, yeah, that tracks.
Somebody else had gordonleary.com, so we went for that instead. There's some guitar teacher. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks. Thank you.